what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and today we are here to talk about women. Wonderful, glorious women, primarily in the art, literary space, who have lived such interesting, fabulous lives, and I think we should all be reading about them. And I kind of came about this video. I was teasing it in my mid-year review video, but I wanted to shed a light on these books that I have seen out and about in the world, and I thought I had read more of them than I have, but that's okay. I'm creating this video because A, I want you guys to be aware, and two, I have accumulated so many little lists and like Amazon wish list carts and whatever as I try to keep track of this stuff, and then it always becomes larger than life, or the list goes somewhere else, or I restart the list. And I was just like, you know what, let's get this properly memorialized in one spot so that I can look back on it. And you know, by doing that, I also then put out a plea to you guys. If you happen to know of any interesting biographies that you think I should check out, drop them in the comments. Let's get ourselves a little recommendations list going. And without any further ado, I'm going to dive right into it. The first book that I want to talk about, so you know, before I even get there, just keep in mind, some of these books, most of these books, I haven't read them, so I can't really tell you too much about them. So just bear with me, okay? The first book that I want to talk about is Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff. Now, this is an interesting biography because Cleopatra is someone who has been written about quite a bit. She is a bit demonized in history and in literature because she was a woman of power, and you know, there's so much you can project onto that. But what Stacy Schiff does is pulling from what we do have, because we have very little from Cleopatra. We have nothing from Cleopatra herself because ancient Egyptian rulers were not known for their, you know, spilling their guts in the papyrus. They were really stoic and, you know, had a united PR effort, I guess you could say. And so what she does is that she looks at what we do have, what was known of other leaders at the time, and then also what the Romans were writing. And obviously most of those guys, most of those guys at the time were really anti-Cleopatra, and they didn't like her. So she's kind of parsing through their language and what they were saying, the mean things that they were saying, to give us a very full 360 portrait of this woman who was quite accomplished for her age. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler who actually spoke Egyptian to her subjects, and she was really able to co-opt the Egyptian religion in order to further her rule. And I think the book is fascinating in the ways in which we see that even though ancient Egypt was at their lowest point in terms of their wealth, they were still so much more far off and better and stronger, more powerful than Rome, which was on the rise. And I think, you know, this book ends and you're left wondering, or at least I'm left wondering, is what the world would have been like had Mark Antony and Cleopatra won against Octavius. I think that's his name. Okay, the next book I'm going to talk about is the next book I want to talk about is Pirouette, The Revolutionary Life of Margaret Cavedish. This book is looking at Margaret. She was an aristocratic daughter who was quite painfully shy as a child, and then lived in the French courts for a little bit, where she was around, you know, really strong women and also seeing fashion and culture. And then she married William Cavendish, and he really helped further her education and gave her the freedom to really express herself. And she became quite a very eccentric dresser and really someone who people would talk about quite a bit. But she was also really prolific writer, writing so much. And her kind of reputation post her death and for many years thereafter was kind of mocked. And even Virginia Woolf had wrote some mean things about her and was like, that's what happens when women are acting up or have too much freedom, whatever, you know what I mean? And so this author, though, is kind of contextualizing her within her time and space, but also looking at the ways in which her writing is, to our modern sensibilities, it seems really crazy, but the author is like, no, she wasn't. This is in line with the other thinkers of the day and age, and she's actually in dialogue with them very nicely and wicked smart. So that's that book. After that, we have Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And this book is really interesting because it starts with something that Laura Ingalls Wilder said towards the end of her life at a public talk that she gave, where she said something like, "The books that I wrote, Little House on the Prairie and the subsequent series, were the truth, capital T, truth, but they were not the whole truth." And so the author is trying to look into what that whole truth was. What was the other stuff that wasn't adequate for these, you know, children's stories, but were still part of who she was as a person. And so what we're really seeing is the ways in which Laura Ingalls Wilder's time on the prairie and that time of her father, and like that myth that is created that they were self-sufficient, these American ideals of self-sufficiency and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and westward expansion. She's like deep diving into that by using Laura Ingalls Wilder's familial history and her own personal life. And then as we move towards the second half of the book, we're also seeing the ways in which Laura's success was sort of aided by her daughter Rose, who is a really troubled person, and you see that relationship, which was quite intense and kind of charged, but you know, very love-hate relationship. And it's really fascinating because it's also just like the relationship between Laura and her daughter Rose is like very rich with material for explorations of that mother-daughter relationship. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was provided lots of material and information to parse through. So the next book we're going to talk about is a book that I read, and then we're going to quickly dovetail into a book that I have not read, because this book that I have read, I didn't entirely love. Now that book is Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life. This is an interesting biographic project because it is not fully biography. It is also a memoir and creative fiction writing. Okay, do you get what I'm saying? So anyways, what Anna Funder has done is that she has taken the life of Eileen and given us a whole lot of color and kind of taken us through her birth to her very early, probably could have been avoided death. And Anna Funder is presenting the case that wifedom, this position or state of being that consists of being alive, it is a role that demands a lot of a woman and often means that one's own creative pursuits or desires are put to rest, forgotten, cast aside in favor of the husband's desires, career aspirations, whatever it may be. And so the other thing that's really interesting here is that George Orwell and many of his biographers, because you'll see in George Orwell's personal diaries, he did not ever really mention Eileen. And as a result of that, his biographers would completely ignore any possible attributions or help that Eileen could have gave him. And so Anna Funder is really shedding a light of that and being like, okay, when George Orwell in his diary said something like prepared for London by doing this, Anna Funder is like, well, he says that, but really who was the person who was preparing the stuff for him? It was Eileen. Eileen was the one who was packing his stuff, making sure he had everything and all that kind of stuff. So she's giving him Eileen that credence, but also kind of showing the ways in which Eileen was instrumental in his writing. George Orwell's prolific work, especially Animal Farm, would not have been possible without Eileen, and she shows the ways in which Eileen's personality and her own relationship to art affected George Orwell and his work. It is a very interesting read, but it was one that I didn't fully love, and so as a result of that, I have to also draw your attention to another biography on Eileen, just in case you want more biographies. And anyways, that book is Eileen, The Making of Orwell. This came out in 2020. And I think in Anna Funder's prologue or whatever it may be, she mentions this book and she's like, we're kind of working with a lot of the same material, but we're drawing different conclusions. And so for that reason, I do think it's interesting to check out because, I don't know, there's a lot that's happening in the world of biographies. Now we are properly moving on to books that I have not read. And we're going to start with two books by the same author. Hermione Lee is a prolific biographer. She can really write. And the two that I want to call out right now are Edith Wharton. Woman was also prolific, quite a writer. She has a house in Western Mass that I need to check out this summer. And then we have the second book, Virginia Woolf. Now, Virginia Woolf I have upstairs in my room, and that book is thick. And I've not gotten into it, but wanted to call out those two books. Next up, we're going to talk about Becoming the Ex-Wife, the unconventional life and forgotten writings of Ursula Parrot. Now, recently, like last year, I think I read Ex-Wife by Ursula Parrot, which was her debut novel that she published in the 1920s anonymously, but everyone kind of knew who wrote it, and this book launched her career. Ex-Wife, if you don't know, is the story of a woman recently divorced who is trying to make it in New York as a single woman, newly single woman, who's also a career woman, and she's dating and she's meeting men and she's trying to live life and kind of grappling with this idea that if women can be their own breadwinners, if they can work, if they can, make money, and they can also divorce, what is it that men are bringing to the table, and how is that shifting that dynamic between men and women, and what is happening if women are as free as they are? And so it's a really wonderful read, really harrowing at times, but also something that is still so pertinent for modern readers. Now, the biography is interesting. I've not read it just yet, but I know it is, because Ursula Parrot is a woman who, wrote this book and then was quite active in her career, writing books, articles. I think she even did screenplays, and she was making so much money and living quite lavishly, and was also having a very exciting love life as all of this was happening, and then ends up dying in obscurity. And I think just the author unpacking that is something that would be worth reading. After that, let's talk about I Used to Live Here Once, The Haunted Life of Jean Rhys. Jean Rhys, if you don't know, wrote Why Sargasso Sea, but before that, she was writing quite a bit, but she didn't really get her proper due attention until Why Sargasso Sea came out, and she was possibly in her 80s, 90s. I also recently read Smile Please, her unfinished biography, which is really harrowing and mostly focuses on her life, like in childhood, her growing up in the Caribbean. And this biography is really interesting because it's using previously unfounded, never before seen paper journals, letters, photographs from Jean Rhys's time in the Caribbean. And I think what's interesting here is that the author is presenting Rhys's life, which was shaped by a lot of tragedy, poverty, turmoil, and she would kind of create this Jean Rhys woman in her writing who was similarly very vulnerable but aware and down and out. And I think the author is presenting the case that Jean Rhys, though she would pull from her personal life, wasn't a victim. So there's something to consider, that book. Next up, I want to talk about the lives of Lee Miller. Now, I believe that this biography was written by her son, and Lee Miller, if you don't know, was, a Vogue model who then became a photographer, and she was really active during World War II. And I think those experiences of those photographs, towards the end of her career, she burned a lot of those photographs from World War II, the original. She was these should never be seen the light of day. I don't want anyone to see these. But that experience, I think, had a big effect on the second half of her life, where she was very dependent on alcohol and became, as her son says, I know this because I read another book at a library last year, but she became a really great cook. So that's that book for you. Next up, I want to talk about Sylvia Townsend Warner, a biography by Claire Harmon. And if you don't know, Sylvia Townsend Warner was an author popping off in the 1920s England, and she wrote Lolly Willowes and a few other books that are really unique for the time in their feminist views and their very unconventional writing and storytelling capabilities. And she was a woman who was part of the literary scene, but also very individualistic. She was in an openly gay relationship with a poet, and I think it's just a book that's been on my radar for a while and I really want to read. After that, we're going to talk about Chasing Beauty, the life of Isabella Stewart Gardner. This book I mentioned in my mid-year wrap-up. This is the story of Isabella Stewart Gardner, a really witch woman who created an institution that is at the heart of Boston's art scene and is a museum that if you've never been to before, it is well worth visiting, because it is not like the most museums which we see, which are very modern, contemporary, stark white walls and crisp, clean lines. This museum was her home. She cultivated this space, and when she gave the museum to the city after her death, she stipulated that it should never be changed, and it hasn't been changed. It's quite beautiful. It's kind of something to consider if you're interested in museum studies. But anyways, this book is looking at her life and the ways in which she was quite individualistic woman and someone who really valued beauty. And I think just that is something that's really fascinating to me, that pursuit of beauty in all of its various forms. The next book I want to talk about is Surreal Spaces, The Life and Art of Leonora Carrington. Leonora Carrington was surrealist author, author and painter, which is what I think is quite interesting about her, was that she was an artist in more than one medium, and she left her family and left her life in Europe in order to embrace new experiences. And I think there's so much I don't know about her, and that's why I want to read this. Next up, we have Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. Now, this is a book that I actually had started, but I had to put it down because I got kind of depressed, and it was really early days. Like, not a lot had happened in the biography, and I was already sad, but I think this is considered to be like the greatest possibly biography that we have on Sylvia Plath. It is really comprehensive. It is really thick. I see it in the bookstores all the time. It's often mocking me, but I will return to it. I can guarantee it. Next up, we have Carson McCullers' A Life. This is a new biography. It just came out in February. I don't know why this wasn't on my radar before. I'm kind of mad because I just remembered that I actually saw this book when I went to the Brattle most recently, but I didn't like the cover. It was kind of dirty, so I didn't pick it up. Anyway, so this is looking at Carson McCullers, the author, and I think she's someone who seemed like she was a really tough personality, and this is kind of shedding light on that. And as a child, she said she'd been born a man. At 20, she marries. You know, there's just lots to really work with. She had a really fraught marriage that lasted 12 years, ended with his suicide in 1953. Sorry, I'm looking at the blurb right now. Sometimes I can annoy people when someone does that, but yeah. That's just a book to have on your radar. After that, we have American Classicist, The Life and Love of Edith Hamilton. Now, this book I've noticed in the bookstores quite a bit, and I don't know, it's just called to me. I didn't know who Edith Hamilton was prior to seeing this book, but she was a woman who started publishing books when she was 62 years old. And she, prior to that, was a headmistress. And what her writing did was it helped introduce so many writers to the classical world. And I think that just sounds so interesting. And the author is making the case that what she was writing about, like her reach extended beyond just what she was doing for classics. After that, we have Miss May Does Not Exist, The Life and Work of Elaine May, Hollywood's Hidden Genius. Now, I was recently listening to a podcast. What is the podcast called? The Lost Lives of Literary Women. Lost Women. It's something like that. It's a book that looks at women authors who are or have been forgotten, and the two hosts are trying to shed more light on these people, and they often have guests who know a lot about the subject, whatever it may be. Anyways, I was listening to that podcast and I found this book, and this book is about Elaine May, who was I think she was Amish, like grew up in an Amish family possibly, but her father was a vaudeville performer and he died very young, and she set off on her own to kind of explore the world and had a really great comedic timing. And she started by kind of doing this acting little skit performance situation with Mike Nichols, and they were doing really well. But then Elaine May, who was a really like unique individual in the sense that she didn't actually want all this public attention, and she felt like she wasn't really able to express herself fully in the ways in which she wanted to and play with her craft the way she wanted to, she decides to drop this act with him and then goes off into her own and explores. And she's writing a lot, and then she's like in LA, she's written this script, and the Paramount is like, you know what, we love this script, we're going to take it, but we're only going to take it if you direct it. And so then she starts directing, and she finds it really challenging working with these production houses, and there's a whole lot happening. And basically this woman is still alive. She's just quite doesn't like public attention. So I guess she didn't really work on this biography with the author, but I don't know, just that podcast episode really made me interested in this woman and her ability to play with form and tell stories. Seemed really interesting. Next up, we have Didion Babitz. This is a little bit different than the previous books that I mentioned, because this book in particular is looking at the relationship between, oh my god, I need water. Next up, we have Didion Babitz. This book is interesting because unlike the previous books, which were primarily focused on one woman, this is looking at Didion and Babitz and their relationship and the ways in which they were opposites, I guess you could say. And I recently got approved for the e-arc on NetGalley, so I'll be reading this ASAP, and I will report back my findings. But I do think this is also a good opportunity to call out the other book that the author had written previously in 2019, which is Hollywood's Eve Babitz and the Secret History of LA. And this is a look into Eve Babitz, her life, her career, the ways in which she was really integrated in LA and had incredible access to a lot of the key players and movers and shakers at the time because of her parents. They were really established in the art scene. Her father, I think, was a composer. And then the next book we're going to talk about is, because I just did mention Edith Babitz and Didion, we now have to focus our attention on a biography on Didion. This is The Last Love Song, and this book came out in 2016, and I don't think I was like as actively aware of what was happening in the bookish space, so I didn't know of this book, and I don't think people really speak about it that much now, but I think it would be good for us to all give it a read, considering, you know, I don't know if we have a Didion biography coming out in the next couple of years. Okay, this next book that I want to talk about, To Anyone Who Ever Asked, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse, is a book that I don't even know how I found this book, but I just started this today, and it's really fascinating because Connie Converse was a woman who was who was producing music in the 1950s that was ahead of its time, like never been done before. It feels quite, you know, like it could come out today. And her music, her lyrics were touching on the malaise and isolation that modernity brings about, but she never experienced critical success or acclaim or any attention in her lifetime. And so she moved back to, but she moved to Michigan where her brother was living and kind of became active in the academic space. But I think she was really unhappy because when she turns, I think 50, maybe 40, she disappears. And so this book, the author is looking at this woman and trying to uncover what he can from her and like what we know of her, what was available. Okay, the next book that I want to talk about is kind of a good way to end this video, because I started with Cleopatra and now we're going to end with Cleopatra's daughter, which is also the name of the book. This is looking at Cleopatra had 3 kids, and I think 2 of them died not quite early, but very shortly thereafter once Cleopatra and Mark Antony died, but one survived really, and not only did she survive, she prospered. She became an African queen, and this book is something I need to read ASAP just to kind of like not finish off, because how can you really finish off learning about these people, but just to conclude that chapter of, you know, the Ptolemaic line and what happened to Cleopatra's offsprings and children. And so that's this video. It was a bit all over the place because it's kind of hard. Don't think I've properly done a video like this where I've spoken about so many books that I haven't read, but these are all books that I'm interested in, and I hope that there's maybe one book at least that you can find from here that piqued your interest and maybe you can check out this summer. I think summer's a great time to read about women, because women have been living in life for so long. And what else did I want to say? Yeah. The final thing that I wanted to add is that biographies really fascinate me for more than one reason. You know, they're a really great intellectual exercise, I think, and something that makes me wonder, like, would I be able to do that? Because the question that we're asking is, how can we know someone? What constitutes knowing someone? What constitutes knowing someone who was quite established in the art or, you know, literary scene? And it's something that makes me think that it would take a lot of time, but yeah, that's the video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.